Hello, my name is Matthew Bach. I'm a teacher at Andover High School, and I'm joined today by School Committee Chairman Joel Blumstein, State Senator Barbara Italian, and School Superintendent Dr. Sheldon Berman. And we're going to discuss maybe what you have seen in your mail recently, the information for voters on the ballot questions, in particular, question 2, which presumes the best thing for the Commonwealth is to raise the cap on charter schools. This is a confusing question to a lot of people, so we thought we would do an analysis of the impact on public schools to give you, the voter, the most accurate information from school leaders and people who participate in the education community. Some of the early facts that you should know is about $450 million of taxpayer money is diverted to charter schools from public school coffers every year in Massachusetts. This would go up dramatically as 12 potential charter schools could be started in the Commonwealth every year in perpetuity if this ballot question were to pass. What we're going to do is take a look behind us at a video that the proponents of question 2 have put out to give us a sense of the highly circulated information that advertisement will bring to you this fall before the election.
I believe in lifting up the kids who are left behind, and that's why I'm a public charter school teacher. All kids deserve a fair shot at a great education. Charter schools are open to all children. It doesn't matter what their language needs are. If they have special needs, we want to serve them. We're ready to serve them. We just need this cap lifted. I think all schools, whether district schools or charter schools, should receive the funding that they need. I know my students are just as deserving as any other student out there. I want all public schools to succeed and all students to succeed. I'm a public school teacher in Massachusetts, and I support lifting the charter school cap.
So with $18 million of advertising support money coming into the pro-yes side on this ballot question, you're going to see this advertisement quite a bit this fall leading up to the election day on November 8th. And most of that money is coming from out-of-state sources, including the heirs to the Walmart fortune and even Michael Bloomberg. So is there anything that stands out to you folks in that video that you'd like to comment on before we get into any other specific areas?
I guess I'd like to say, having followed this issue now for over a decade, the comment that we accept all students just really doesn't hold up. It is true that kids get in through a lottery, but it's also true that there are many of those children who enter into the charter school process who may be returned to their public sending school for a number of reasons. It may be that they are on an ed plan or need to be on an ed plan. Oftentimes those kids are either it's sort of spoken to them and the families, and they sort of counsel them back to the public school, and or through the use of very rigid behavioral programs and behavioral codes of conduct. And it's also true that very few English as a second language students throughout the state are being served in charter schools. So I guess I take exception with this notion that anyone who wants to put their name in, get chosen by lottery, gets into a charter school and stays. That those numbers just don't hold up.
That's a good point. I believe that Northeastern University's law school just produced an amicus brief, actually, that supports a lot of what you just mentioned, the fact that English language learners and students of color receive a higher suspension rate in charter schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll make 2 points to supplement Senator Italian's comments. One is the statement that's made that there'd be more funding for public schools. It's in that ad. I've seen it in another ad, and from everything I know, that is simply not true. The funding is very limited, and frankly, one of the key issues regarding this question is the funding formula, which just clearly, whether it's a more affluent town such as Andover or a less affluent town, really works to the disadvantage of the existing public schools. Second point I'll make is that they refer to trying to serve all students. But if you take a close look, I mean, what a lot of the conversation is around are the students on a waiting list for charter schools. And you know, I went to a website of one of the proponents of charter schools, and they claim 45,000 students on a waiting list. I believe the numbers are lower than that, but even if you assume that that is correct, it's worth noting that there are over 950,000 children in our public schools in the state. So those students are a very small percentage, and I think what really gets ignored are the probably well over 90% of the rest of the students, and how are we going to serve them if a disproportionate amount of money is going to charter schools, leaving less for the existing public schools, and how are we going to serve that 90+% of our students?
Yeah, the disparity is extremely significant.
Can I just say one thing before you, just to piggyback on what he said? Our state auditor has questioned the number of students that are on the wait list. So she's done an independent evaluation, and in fact, the number on the wait list has been greatly exaggerated and inflated. Sorry.
Back in 2005, I led a task force of superintendents that evaluated charter schools at that point, and we made a number of recommendations because we were trying to reduce the tensions between charter and public schools. And some of those recommendations were, first of all, to change the financing, which clearly compromises public schools in a very significant way, to change the admission policies, because it was clear to us then, and it's still clear to us, that fewer English language learners, fewer special education students, fewer students who have behavior issues are in charter schools. And we also wanted to change the accountability system because, you know, frankly, there is a public purpose to schools, and that is we have a democracy, and we're, you know, attempting to create citizens who are, you know, effective, involved, engaged, but also understand the others who are around them and the diversity of others who are around them. And what we found in charter schools is that that kind of selectivity was serving students who are already well served by the public schools and not serving students who really needed alternatives. You know, what stands in such contrast, I had the opportunity to be in Kentucky and in Oregon as a superintendent, and Kentucky held off on charter schools, and in fact is still holding off on charter schools because they felt it would further segregate populations, and as has happened in the charter schools here in the Commonwealth. In Oregon, I had 4 charter schools right within my district, and actually they functioned quite well, but the contrast was stark. They only received 80% of the per pupil costs and nothing for construction, which stands in stark contrast to the funding here. They had to be approved by the local school board, and the local school board had oversight, which made them responsible to individuals within the community. And so they had to serve a public purpose within the community. And we also controlled, in a sense, who they selected in their admissions policies. And so we ensured that they did not discriminate and they did not exclude other students. So I think there's a lot of policy problems that we have with charter schools, and until those are fixed, I'm deeply concerned about the expansion of charter schools, because I think it just exacerbates the problem and accelerates the kind of antagonism that is so divisive in this debate.
That's a really important point, and your experience in Oregon is really illuminating because of that notion of governance and who actually governs the charter schools. And if we were just to go past funding and take a look at oversight and governance, in Massachusetts, out of about 71 charter schools, 60 have no parents on their boards of directors. You are all parents of students who have gone through the public schools. And just to throw another piece of data, the Annenberg Institute from Brown University has found that in Massachusetts, if you look at the charter school boards, 1/3 of the trustees are affiliated with financial services or corporate sectors. So exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Berman, this idea of democratic oversight and then teaching students to be participants in that democratic oversight is something we're not seeing in charter schools, and maybe would even be taken away from our public school governance. So Joel, as the chairman of the school committee, I know you want to speak to the issue of funding, and I'd be happy if you did that. Could you also talk also a little bit about governance and what it is you think is essential about having local accountability?
Sure. I think we've touched a little bit on funding, but in terms of governance, I think one key fact to understand is that, particularly in a town like Andover, only a very small percentage of the funding that we get comes from state aid, referred to as Chapter 70 aid. The vast majority of the funding for our schools comes from local sources, particularly property taxes. But under this, what's referred to as the money following the student, if a student from Andover were to move to a public school, the vast majority of that money, something on the order of 87% of that money, would be local money, with no oversight by members of town meeting or our local elected officials. As an elected school committee member, I am responsible to the residents of Andover. If they don't like the job I'm doing, I have a 3-year term, and they are free to elect someone else who's going to more serve their needs. So that accountability simply doesn't exist with the charter. So I think it's really important for there to be, particularly when we're talking about a lot of local money, for there to be accountability on the part of our local officials.
Yeah, otherwise, I think some people in Massachusetts a couple hundred years ago would have referred to that as taxation without representation, right?
So I'd just like to say that I served on the school committee here in Andover when a charter school proposal came forward. And those issues came up of funding and of accountability and of the fact that we had very little say. We had the state authority that chooses whether a charter comes through or not come in and give a presentation. It was found that it was duplicative with what we were already providing in our public schools, and it was really going to hurt our funding mechanism. So it actually, in that instance, never even made it off the drawing board. It never even went to a vote, never came and happened. But in other communities where they have a high number of charters now and a large amount of money leaving the system, you receive funding for a very short period of time, for 4 years, and that number drops down dramatically with each year. We can't even, as a state, make the commitment for that funding now. So we have large cities that are supposed to be reimbursed over, again, only a very brief period of time. We can't even meet that funding requirement. So therefore, people who are big charter school fans, like Mayor Marty Walsh, who's on the board of one of these charters in Boston, doesn't believe this question should be passed because he understands there's no funding attached to this. He understands that raising the cap over and above, and by the way, there's capacity now within the cap, but adding 12 more per year anywhere all over the state with no funding makes no sense and is going to really work to the disadvantage of the very large cities. It could come back here as well. It could be an option in suburbia. But he's smart enough to know there's no money and that this could really spiral the public school system as we know it out of control.
Right, and along with Marty Walsh, you have, as of the most recent count last night, 120 school committees in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who have voted on resolutions to oppose question 2, and so far 0 on the other side to promote it.
It's
And if I
important.
could-
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's important to know, I voted on the ed reform package in 2010. And so some of us who knew what was going on in terms of ELL students and special needs students, as part of allowing a raising of the cap, compromised and put in that in fact charter schools would have to accept and retain ELL and special needs students. And in fact, that has not been the case. And it's also a fact that there is currently capacity within the cap. People don't talk about that, but there is currently capacity.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure your viewers know, Matt, that the Andover School Committee is among those 120 that did pass a resolution opposing lifting the cap with that last.
I wouldn't let us out of the
June.
room until they were aware of it.
Yeah.
Proudly
Yeah, so
aware.
we did that. Yes, we frankly, I raised it with the school committee back in June, and frankly made it clear to the school committee that this was not something they were obligated to do. They did not have to take a position on this issue, but after discussing it, after hearing Dr. Berman's views, we did vote to pass a resolution.
And so it as not a partisan issue, but almost a pragmatic issue as well. And you were feeling that this was the practical thing to
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
You know, there's one other side of this that hasn't really come out, and that is the performance side of it. Back in 2009, Stanford did a really comprehensive national study of charter schools, and there were, I think, about 3,000 charter schools that they looked at. And at the time, they found that the charter schools outperformed the schools from which they drew students by about 17%. So 17% of the charter schools outperformed the public schools. On the other hand, 37% underperformed, and the rest were about the same. So we're investing a great deal of funds and a great deal of time in an experiment that hasn't proven to advance public education. You know, Massachusetts has done a little bit better in its charter schools than nationally, but frankly, our schools are the top in the country, and we, in general, do better. When charter schools were first proposed, they were proposed for a couple of reasons. One was to sort of break the mold, have people, and particularly teachers, have the opportunity to make proposals for innovative charter schools that could then influence public education and change public education. What has happened is that that has been absent. There have been some effective charter schools, but for the most part, there's virtually no relationship between the charter schools and the public schools from which they draw students. And the charter schools don't tend to be innovative. They tend to be actually quite traditional in approach. So we're not seeing the gains that were originally proposed or the rationale that was originally the motivation realized in the results that we've seen. So I'm disappointed by the movement. I'm disappointed by the results, and I'm disappointed about the impact it's had on public education in Massachusetts. And we sit here with a very divisive debate about charter schools when we should be investing in public education and seeing ways to support public education as best as we can. And we're in an internal debate about one school versus another type of school. Just doesn't, I don't think doesn't serve well the public purpose.
I would agree with that, and I think some essential points that you bring up, the notion of traditional schools being employed as a method to get results in a charter school, testing, maybe very standardized curriculums, things that aren't necessarily innovative, which brings us to our last issue here, which is student impact, because there is an impact on students here. Where I live in Malden, Massachusetts, our public schools lose $9 million a year to the charter school in that area, and we had about a $2.5 million shortfall in our budget this past year, and the charter school ironically had a $3 million surplus. And they purchased real estate in the city of Malden with that surplus. The money did not come back to Malden, and we don't have buses for our students in the city of Malden. They have to walk to school or take public transit. And another thing that comes to mind, listening to you, Dr. Berman, is the idea of perseverance, which is a concept that has been brought up in this conversation, I think by the NAACP, who has voted to have a moratorium on charter schools. But the idea that students who do succeed in charters, how many of them do finish a college degree? How many of them are persevering to the next level? And so if anybody has any thoughts on student impact, I'd like to wrap it up with that. And
Well, I think the study that, well, first of all, my experience in other communities in other states, and my discussions with other educators around the country, what emerges from those conversations is that the charter schools really have had not a great deal of impact on student performance. That students, to some degree, perform as well as they would in other situations. We have failing charter schools. We have charter schools around the country that have gone bankrupt or been corrupt with very little oversight. Now, we've been, I think, more careful here in Massachusetts, but we still have those kinds of problems and those kinds of issues. What I would love to see is a reorganization and reauthorization of that law, so that the charter schools become responsible to the communities in which they reside, and that school boards or school committees here take some control and have some governance authority over the charter schools, and that we reform finance so that the finance does not compromise the public schools like they have in Malden. I think that's a very serious issue.
All of those issues were addressed and rolled into the Senate proposal, which was on charters, which was to focus on 100% of the students, not just the 4% that attend charters, to make sure there was local control.
And you were key in designing that proposal.
Yes, and we wanted local control. We wanted funding to hit 100% of the students, all schools. There needed to be a place to account for that additional money that would be required over time. But that was seen as a compromise to avoid having to go on the ballot, and that was soundly rejected by the charter school folks because they don't want local control. And I don't think the funding issues concern them. I think they are happy with the status quo. I'd just like to say one other thing that I find quite disturbing. When these first started, my understanding from colleagues who served in the legislature at the time, back in the 80s during the original ed reform, these were seen as an alternative to a voucher system and seen as a compromise. They were seen as innovation, short in duration, gather what's learned and bring it back up the chain to the public schools, and we know that that has not happened. I think that some that started charter schools were public school teachers. There's one in Lawrence that's very good. It's wonderful. It started with a cadre of public school teachers, and it was very focused on Lawrence and what they needed. But what we're seeing both in our state and nationally is what I would call a corporatization of charter, sort of big money trying to fund this as a business. The fact that I've had 3 colleagues in the Senate in the last 6 months have $100,000 be put into each of their races by the pro-charter folks tells me that there's something more going on here than just the best interests of those students. There's something being motivated in terms of money that's flowing into our state to fund these ads. It concerns me very deeply that big money's coming in from out of state to fund an issue that I think should really be decided at the local level. Whether a community wants or doesn't want a charter school is something that should happen at the local level. And we should mention also that there are Horace Mann charters, which are an alternative that's maybe a step between the two. Horace Manns are under local control. And so that's an alternative that can be looked at as well, that isn't utilized all that often, but there is one in Haverhill, not so far from here.
Certainly, yes. And one might ask, if the Waltons wanted to devote so much money and resource, why don't they just open a school and take all the students and educate them for free?
Yeah, I'll just say, for me, the bottom line is, and I think our challenge as public officials, whether at the local level or the state level, is, how can we do the most good for the most students? We're going to have limited funding, at the state level, at the local level, and how can we best serve the most students? And a proposal that puts a disproportionate amount of money towards a small percentage of students, just in my mind, is not going to serve that purpose.
Matt, one other factor that's often unseen is teacher turnover. we just did, and I reported out in my presentation last spring to all the teachers that we have a 91% retention rate for our staff. It's an extraordinarily stable staff. When you have a stable staff like that, people know who to count on. You can grow professionally, you can work with others, build a sense of team, and you create an organization that has a larger life than just, you know, a transitional group of people who move in and out. The charters have extraordinary transition in staff. They tend to burn out their staff within 2 to 3 years. You know, having been the person both in Hudson when I was there for 14 years and here, we have many charter teachers applying for positions in traditional public schools because of the instability in the charter school, and because in fact they're working at lower wages, which is where the profit comes from in the charters. They lack the benefits, and they look for stability and strength in an organization like the Andover schools. But it's something that isn't recognized, that turnover actually deprives the students in charter schools of the richness that comes from experience. Many of the teachers in charters are new teachers right out of graduate school. And they don't have the wealth of experience that you and others like you bring to the classroom. And so it's some of the hidden costs of charters that we don't look at, but they're significant. And it says a lot about the value that we offer and that public schools offer to children, and that stability.
Experience should be celebrated
Yes.
and transferred to the student.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you folks for being a part of this analysis, and if there is additional confusion by our viewing public, they can find answers at saveourpublicschoolsma.com and massteacher.org, and of course email any of you and get the full story on ballot question 2.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.